Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parenting is Easy podcast, where we will discuss the pleasures and the frustrations, the good and the bad, and the rewarding and the troubling aspects of parenting. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, and I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in working with teenagers, young adults, and parents with a specific niche and assisting with communication within the family dynamics. While everyone has their own unique journey and experiences as a parent and as a child, there are many common affiliations and attributes that we can all relate to and share. Together, we will learn from personal stories and experiences from parents across many different backgrounds, cultures, and communities. So get comfortable, grab your glass of coffee, and let's get right into the interview. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Parenting is Easy, said no one ever. Today, I have a special treat, and this is the first time we're doing this here on the podcast, and I'm really excited to introduce Suzy and her son, Isack, who are also business partners, and I want them to talk about what it is that they're doing over here. Suzy and Isack are both emergency room nurses, and they have an amazing story to share on their experience in life and loss and laughs and loves together. And without further ado, I'm going to let each one of them do their own little introduction for who they are and what brings them here and how we can gain and grow from their story. So Suzy, let's start off with you. Can you introduce yourself a little bit, please?
Yeah, my name is Suzy, and I am in my early 40s, and I am a mother, of course, as my son is right here, but only one child. I did sort of foster my teenage niece for a few years, and I was married for a really long time. My first husband passed away, Isaac's dad, about 5.5 years ago. Currently remarried, have a few French bulldogs, and just moved out here to California for the first time. So I'm from Minnesota. That's currently where Isack is. So just kind of in this space in my life where I'm just actually trying to refigure things out, not only because there was a huge transition with the death of my husband, but also Isaac's an adult now. So, two big transitions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think there are so many things there that I would love to unpack a little bit. But before we do, Isack, welcome to the show. Thank you so much.
Yes. Hello. My name's Isack. Excuse me. I'm 23 years old. I obviously was born and raised in Minnesota. Still live here now. I do work in the emergency room as a nurse as well, as you mentioned earlier. Otherwise, I am an only child. My dad did die back in 2018, and that was kind of a big, I would say, cornerstone in both of our lives and our relationship and everything like that. My mom and I have always been very close, but I think our story has definitely presented some challenges in our relationship, so it's been interesting kind of navigating that. But we've definitely always made it a priority to be close and have open communication and everything. Part of that, you mentioned we were business partners, and so we've been producing our own podcast called It's Going, which is a play off, how's it going? Oh, it's going, and that's to start with. We're basically just talking about very in depth what happened with my dad and going through that loss together, some of the mental health issues that were a part of that whole situation, and how we both individually dealt with it, and then we get really in depth and raw with that emotional story. So go check that out if you're interested.
Where can they find your podcast?
All the
Everywhere.
things. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Prime Podcast, or whatever.
Love it.
It's pretty
and
much.
It's called It's Going.
Yep.
Love it. Okay. And I think this topic is something that is going to be, I think, very helpful to a lot of people. But I guess bringing it here to our conversation, and Isack, hearing from you, it was only 5 years ago where your dad died. Could you talk a little bit about before the house you grew up in, and at least from the little bit both of you are talking, Sounds like you grew up in a home where you knew what your parents' relationship was like to each other, and therefore how that sort of came into play regarding the parenting that you were part of, you were the product of. What was that experience like growing up?
Um, well, both of my parents were uh, very poignant about how they wanted to parent me, and we've all kind of discussed this in depth, especially as I've gotten older and become an adult. My mom has talked about this fairly in depth, but they were very purposeful with how they raised me. I know, obviously, my parents have kind of been the model of love that I've sought after in terms of how they cared for each other and loved each other. They were very close. We came from a household that was very open communication. That was one thing that, especially, I would say my mom pushed a lot when I was younger, of trying to make it a safe environment to talk about anything and everything, to the point now where we talk about a lot of things that mother and son, probably most relationships, would not be comfortable talking about. So part of that comes from being in the medical field too, I'm sure. But
I'm sure, I'm sure, and having a certain language that most people necessarily wouldn't have with their parents.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But we've always been very open as a family, and I we always would do things together as a family. We were kind of a very close little pod, I would say. Not to say that we didn't have our disagreements and issues, just like any family does, but
Sure.
I would say growing up, I always tended to be a lot closer to my parents than my friends were to theirs. So I think that
That's
had
really
a big
beautiful.
impact on me growing up.
Sure. And then, Suzy, I wanted to take it over to you. First of all, what's it like hearing Isack say this? And you probably heard us a number of times at this point, but there you are sitting, you're observing your son talking about the relationship that you had with your late husband, and then also the effect that it had on him. What's coming up for you as you sort of hear that from him?
I think in general, like when I hear things like that, or when there was a very specific point in time when he was a teenager, because as Isack said, it was very purposeful for us. I grew up in a very chaotic, dysfunctional, probably what we would consider abusive environment nowadays. And like Isack said, I was really purposeful, and my husband was as well, but I really drove that consciousness around like really being purposeful around how we communicated, how we disciplined, all of those things. And so for me, like my reaction when I hear that stuff is kind of just like, yes, we did it.
You did it.
We did it. And that was like one of those things. So like when he was little, I just remember when I was growing up that it wasn't safe to talk to my parents about anything. Obviously, you learn about a lot of
If
things
anything,
from...
we were like trying to like hide things as much as we can in a certain way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
And not only in my family was it not safe to talk about things because things got weaponized. My parents never kept, trust or secrets, not secrets, but, like confidence. And there was just a lot of chaos, a lot of yelling, a lot of all this stuff. And I just remember thinking, I really watched like my siblings especially struggle as teenagers with all the things that teenagers struggle with when you have a really dysfunctional family. So like running away in the middle of the night, getting involved with, the quote unquote wrong crowd, experimenting with drugs. Like my sister got pregnant when she was 15, like all this stuff. And I just very clearly, and I did have Isack when I was young. So I was still a teenager when I had him, although I was married. And I just remember thinking, I wanted to foster an environment where Isack recognizes that whether or not he makes mistakes, which are inevitable because he's a child and that's how you grow and you learn, that it's always safe to come and talk to us about it. And one of the things we always used to kind of say was like, you're not going to, you might get in trouble for your behavior, because all behavior has consequences, right? So like if you're working on good things, you have good consequences. And if you do some naughty things, you have maybe not so nice consequences. And however, if you lie about it on top of it, it's way worse. And so we really tried to foster that environment. And part of it was also in terms of just being really open about everything, was the concept of, I just had this philosophy of, if he's old enough to ask the question, he's old enough to get the answer. And so he always knew from a very young age that he could come and ask us anything. And like, we would just tell him the straightforward truth about whatever. I mean, even the uncomfortable topics. What I learned as he got older is that kids only remember what's relevant to them. So like, we had to have the sex talk with him when he was really young, because it had come up in like a social situation for him. And, you know, again, he asked about it. We gave him an answer. I think it was like 3-4 years later. We're like, yeah, you remember, like, we've talked about this. And he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because at that age, it wasn't relevant for him. Like, it didn't make sense, you know?
Right.
So like, I do think it's less about the topic and recognizing that kids absorb what really is relevant to them at that time, but also it just fosters that idea of like, it is always safe to talk to my parents. And so when Isaac was like,
Exactly.
15 or 16, I think, it was kind of another one of those moments where I was like, okay, what we've been doing has worked, because he had come to sit down and talk to us about a situation that was going on with his friend that he was concerned about and didn't know how to handle. And ultimately that was our goal, was I want him to be a teenager that feels like he can talk to us about these situations that he might find himself in.
Beautiful. And I, as a psychotherapist working with teenagers, I think one of the things that I talk about, and there are many different ways to go about this, but I think overall, Suzy, to your point, is instead of having a house where a child says, oh my gosh, I hope my parents don't find out, we want to harbor a situation where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to tell my parents. And where it's something where just the possibility of them coming back to us to be able to talk to us and opening that door. If that first conversation about sex, there's nothing that Isaac remembers from it, but he does remember the fact that mom and dad's door was open, and therefore that brings in the next conversation. So I think that's something that creates such a safe, warm environment for a child to always go back to, and it really manifests itself in so many ways in relationships that they have with us as their parents, but also what they're looking for in a partner or in their friend groups as well, and what it is that they value. So I just turning it over here just to this point of that close relationship, and then you have a situation when unfortunately it's a loved one that's lost. Walk us through a little bit of like, Suzy, I'll start with you. Just what was that like? Experiencing that loss, both for yourself but also as a mom, and what your role was, and how you sort of struggled with that, in those beginning years, and maybe even through today.
Yeah. I mean, and this is a lot of stuff that we cover in our podcast as well, is really just kind of going through those moments. But, in my family role, in my family of origin, my coping mechanism for dealing with all the chaos was crisis management. Like, I was the person that went into the who, what, where, when, how do we fix this? What do we do? And when Isaac's dad died, there was a lot of obviously shock that comes with that. But for me being the parent, like, I still had to hold things together and figure out the who, what, where, when, like all the stuff that was going on. And then also, I think it's just incredibly, it's devastating regardless across the board. I remember dreading having to tell my husband's parents what happened. And again, it's not like I had, it wasn't my fault, but like just to have to be the messenger was that he had died. I mean, I dreaded that, but Isaac was there when, he heard the sheriff say on the phone that there was going to be an autopsy, and he had this just look of complete devastation, and and it's just such a hard thing to see your kid go through, because him and his dad were super close. And so, obviously, like he said, we were all really close. So, yeah. And even today, we find that as we continue down this journey, we both have very different time frames around when we deal with different things. So like this last year was a lot harder for Isaac, because he is dealing with starting to really see like his friends get older, get into serious relationships, having an adult relationship with their dad. He's starting to have an adult relationship with me, and he's not going to get to have that with his dad. So, so we deal with things kind of, at different time frames, and they were different relationships. So it is a challenging thing to navigate.
For sure. And when you see your son struggle, and not necessarily even from the things that he's telling you, but from a mom's point of view, with the mom's superhuman inhibition to see and feel things in a child, what can you talk about that experience of what that's like for you to see your son go through something, whether it's sorrow, loss, grief, or just the pains of growing pains, and doing it from a single parent's perspective, and what that's like for you?
Yeah, I mean, and I was fortunate enough that, he was almost 18 when his dad died, and I think for him as well. I can't imagine if it had happened when he was much younger. So he got like the full teenage experience with his dad, but I think there's just a level of helplessness that comes with it when you're watching your kids struggle with anything. And especially because, I worked really hard specifically to not shield Isack from the world, shield him from experiencing super traumatic things, because I grew up in a world full of trauma. And so, that was part of that open dialogue, is we always talked about things. He was very aware of the stuff that went on in my family. But not being able to protect him from, any of this, and also like, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with it myself. And so it's a very helpless feeling when, you see somebody absolutely devastated, your child especially, and literally there's nothing you can do to take it away.
100%. I to that point over here, and I want to press you a little more on this concept of you're talking about the struggle, and you feeling the struggle, for yourself, but also for your son, for what he's going through. How do you embrace, or maybe acknowledge and deal with that struggle in itself? And how does that show itself within parenting and how you deal with your son?
I think, again, because we had already established like this pattern of open communication, I mean, that made a huge difference.
Okay.
Because we were able to talk to each other about things. And again, like Isack mentioned earlier, it's not like we didn't have challenges during this process, because, he's growing up. We're both mourning completely different relationships. His grief is not the same as my grief. I can maybe somewhat relate a little bit more to what it might be like losing a parent. He has not been in a real serious relationship. So, he isn't necessarily able to completely relate to like what I may or may not be experiencing. And so, I think the communication piece was key, honestly. I mean, there were lots of times where we would have friction because we just weren't understanding where each other were coming from, and that ability to just go back and kind of hash it out. And but there came a period of time when I just literally just wanted to bury myself in the bed and not really do anything. So, and I'm sure Isack can talk a little bit about kind of how he experienced that. But I think, yeah, I don't, people always go like, how did you do that? And it's like, I have no idea. Like, you just deal with it, but had we not had that foundation to begin with, I think it would have been a lot harder, because you need to have people to talk to during this type of thing.
For sure.
And I think as a parent, you need to be able to talk to your child about the things that they're experiencing in this situation.
Right. And even the things that sometimes that we're experiencing, that like, hey, mom is having a hard time with this too. And I think just the acknowledgement, like, you're talking about that communication, the acknowledgement of the struggle, and kids also seeing that in itself. Like, oh, okay, so mommy's a lot of struggle. Yeah, mommy's human being. And I also struggle.
Yeah.
Yes, we're having different types of suffering, but I'm just as human as you are, and I'm also going through
Yeah.
things. And I think that's to your point you were saying of being able to, to say that over to him. It's I
Yeah.
think a very big part of how to deal with the grief.
And I think prior to that too, I mean, Isack can speak more to this, but we did spend a lot of time really helping him see that we're human, even when he was little, because um, I think a lot of people remember like that distinct period of time where you start to realize like, oh, your parents are not perfect, right? And it kind of comes at a later time. And so, we made a conscious effort to, apologize when we messed up, if we, or negotiation, his ability to come back to us and be like, okay, I don't like your decision, and here's why, and like negotiate things with us, so if we said no, it wasn't necessarily that he could talk us into saying yes, but we would acknowledge when he had the ability to be like, okay, those are valid points,
Right.
maybe we can come
And
to the
talk
middle.
to them,
Yeah. And I think, Isack can maybe explain a little bit more about like how that impacted him, but I think those are some of the tactics that we very much employed,
right. And
that
that's
then
probably, it sounds
helped
like
us
something
later.
that was able to, exactly, and it's able to
Yeah.
continue even after the loss in itself. Isack, before there's a lot to unpack over there, to just assist me in this over here, you hearing your mother talk about her struggle and what's it like trying to communicate with you. What's it like hearing that from her? And I'm curious what your point of view is regarding what that period of grief was like, knowing that mom is also struggling, different than I'm struggling, but yet we're still struggling, and there is a concept of struggling together, how that could be helpful in a certain way.
I think that the biggest issue that we faced when it came to that period was that we both had very, very different ways of dealing with everything. Obviously a lot of my behaviors and coping skills and like the things that I found important during that period were also shared by like what my dad found important. And my as much as my parents loved each other, they were very different in a lot of ways when it came to just daily life, which they complemented each.
Could you give an example?
Well, I would say like my mom is very good at doing research and like all of kind of the background things of daily life, where you don't really see it, but it's still a lot of work, like dealing with finances and doing research to find resources and making sure that like when it came to school, she was always on top of making sure I knew, what my options were in terms of like classes or post-secondary college enrollment opportunities and all. She's very good at, managing the, let's say like behind the scenes of daily life, whereas my dad was always much more of the practical, what's happening right now, we need to get the house clean, we need to make dinner, I need to provide, financially for the family, like all of those sorts of things. Not saying that my mom didn't contribute to those things either, but I would say they were both focused on, different things in that manner. And so they complemented each other very well, because my dad didn't like to deal with the things that my mom did, and my mom didn't really like to deal with the things that my dad often did. But then when my dad died, that left a very big hole in our family in terms of things that needed to be taken care of. And I would say I felt like a lot of that responsibility fell on me, because if I didn't do it, then it just didn't get done,
And
so
talked a little bit, seeing your mom struggle through the loss. What was that like for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think being as young as I was, granted, I was 17, 18, and like she said, I've never had a relationship on the level that they did. I mean, obviously they were married for 20 years. They were deeply in love. They, they were each other's best friends and confidants and like life partners. It's a whole different thing. And
Right.
I don't know what it's like to be in her shoes. And I think I didn't give that enough thought, because I was kind of focused on my own issues and my own grief. And all the things that were happening to me. My whole world had fallen apart, and obviously hers did too, but I think I was a lot more focused on my stuff.
Yeah.
And it was hard seeing her, go through that, because I knew she was struggling really hard. And I think it's also, in a similar way, a feeling of helplessness, because it's like, I am not equipped, as a 17-year-old kid to help my mother deal with the grief of losing her
100%.
husband. I would try to do things to help when I could, but then at the same time, I probably added even more to her plate at the same, just in the same way
For sure.
that she did towards me, like she would help when she could, but then at the same time, because we live together and because we have a relationship and because we are both dealing with the same thing, we probably added a lot more to each other's plates than necessarily taking away. But that's part of, we became each other's support system as well. So I think some of the weird things, or some of the things that, we had to kind of later establish maybe some boundaries on was, a lot of the things that she would normally go to my dad about, she would start coming to me about, because especially once my cousin kind of came into the picture, and, we were essentially fostering her. She was a few years younger than me, but I would say a lot more mature than she was, given her upbringing versus mine and the things that I had dealt with. And so, so even though I'm an only child, I ended up in that big sibling, big brother role, where and especially not having my father there, like when my mom couldn't deal with the situation. Yeah, with my mom, when she had a situation that she couldn't really quite deal with, or didn't know how to, she would often come to me to, help. And that was something that, like, in that moment maybe was, again, something that I probably wasn't the most prepared for. And kind of had to be like, well, I don't know if this is really my responsibility. But I think the hardest part for me in terms of watching my mom go through all of that is there was a significant period where it felt like she was just struggling with, like, everything. Like
I was.
Well, obviously for good reason, right? But it was really difficult seeing somebody who had always been so strong in my life not be able to get out of bed some days, not be able to, take care of herself in some days. And there were month-long periods, where she would, lay in bed and then go to work because she had to provide, and then go, and not really do anything. And I've learned now, obviously, that that's not necessarily uncommon when it comes to losing a spouse like that, or losing anybody like that. People fall into that grief, but that was difficult for me to watch in general, because, like I said, she had always been a rock in my life, and like the strong person, and she had always been the crisis manager, and
been your support in so many ways. So when you look back at it now, I mean, it's only been 5 years, and we go say it's been 5 years, and there's been so much that's happened, and so much growth and change. Isaac, I want to put this question to you first. Looking back on it over the past 5 years, and, you have a conversation with mom, and you're sitting on the high plateau where you guys are, and you look back over the past 5 years and you say, whoa, look what we accomplished. We did blank in our relationship. What would be those first one or two things that come to mind regarding how you guys were able to work and grow with the relationship?
I would say communication has, again, it's the backbone of any relationship, but I think that's been the biggest thing that has kept us close. Because I know that no matter what issues we have with each other, because not to, like, especially in the last 5 years, there has been quite a lot of friction between us, just given the circumstances that we were thrust into,
Right.
and our different perspectives on things. And um,
Well,
and
and
that's
Isaac and I are very similar in personality. So you add that mix into it. And his dad
but
was the buffer. So like,
yeah,
yeah,
we
that's
butt
been a
heads a bit,
challenging
and
thing to navigate.
Right.
but the strongest point of that is we both obviously love each other very much and care about each other very much.
Mm-hmm.
And so throughout our entire relationship, there's been an emphasis on, if we have an issue with each other, we're going to hash it out. And we're going to not stop
Mm-hmm.
hashing it out until
Right.
it's resolved. And I think, even just noticing how, and I've carried that into pretty much every relationship in my life, like whether it's my friends or family or, girls that I'm interested in or whatever. I've always been very upfront and honest, but also like, if I have an issue, I'm not afraid to approach you with it. And it's not you did something wrong. You are, this is a you problem. It's hey, this is something that is affecting me. If you care about me, can we talk
Sure.
about it and try to come to a resolution? Because most issues in any relationship come down to miscommunication. And so if you have that,
Mm-hmm.
backbone of, okay, there's obviously some sort of friction here, there's something wrong, and let's talk about it until we fully understand each other, and then you can come to a resolution or a compromise, because you have that level of empathy for the other person, because you understand
sure.
where they're coming from. And I
Right.
think that's the biggest issue, especially in a lot of like parental and child relationships, is a huge misunderstanding. You think about like the teenager who is always like, I don't go to my parents because they don't understand me. They want to understand you most of the time, but it's a skill that you have to develop in terms of communicating in a healthy way that's not attacking each other.
And it
And
goes
that's
both
something that we've
ways,
always
right? It's
right
it's
Mhm.
right
it's from the teenager to the child, from the teenager to the parents, and knowing how to talk to them in a way that they can understand, even though they never will, could they speak in the language, or to the parents to the child, saying the same thing, saying, "Hey, I want to understand you," and the great Jerry Maguire said, "No, help me help you, and let's figure that out. How to sort of make it something that we can work on this together." And Suzy, putting it to you, hearing Isaac say his words of wisdom and from his experience, and it's a lifetime worth of experience in only 23 years, or even the past 5 years that we're talking about here now. What has sort of been the key for you when you look back over the past couple of years and say, wow, look what we were able to do, we were able to accomplish blank together in your relationship between you and your son?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been acutely aware of, just in general, like when something tragic happens or there's some sort of massive trauma, it often fractures families. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a death. I mean, I had family members where, like like not immediate family members, but like extended family members where like my cousin or whatever was sexually assaulted, and like it just fractures everybody around her. And like, because there is this tendency to like not want to go to like the deep stuff, to not want to communicate about something, or like, I just don't want to deal with it, so we're just going to pretend like it didn't happen. And so I think,
it's hard,
and that's
it's
just
difficult, and so therefore it's uncomfortable, and then
So let's
and
just
you
avoid
want to stay
it.
away from it, right?
Yeah. And I saw that so much, and I've seen that in friends. I've seen that in just other, people. I love watching documentaries and things like that, but you see a lot of fractured families when something super traumatic happens, because everybody experiences that trauma slightly differently, even if it happens to a family at the same time. And everybody deals with it differently. So, and again, like I said, in this situation, I lost a spouse, a best friend, the father of my child. I grew up with him. Like, we grew up together. He
Right,
lost his dad.
Right.
Literally, he lost his dad. And we very easily could have not had a relationship at this point, because it's not easy to try to navigate that when you literally are falling apart. Like, both of us were literally falling apart, because it rocked both of our worlds and everything was different for both of us. Even the way that we, like, Isack talks about this. I believe we talked about it in the podcast just recently, about how our entire way of interacting with each other was completely changed in just that moment, because that whole dynamic shifted
My
when he
dad was
died.
always a part of that line of communication. He was always, either a third party or a buffer, or he oftentimes was even the one that I went to about a lot of things. And so when he was no longer there, and like she said earlier, we're very similar, and he tended to be a buffer, where he was very good at understanding each of us and then putting it in ways that made it easier for us to empathize with each other.
Yeah.
Think about it from her perspective. Think about it from his perspective.
Yeah.
Right.
He was that good buffer,
He
and
was
then
the
not
master
having him
communicator, negotiator, and that was something that was ripped away from both of you. So it sort of created like, okay, so we're both here, we're both missing that ground in between us. Let's try to figure out how we can sort of bring the gap together. And I think that's something that I'm hearing from you.
Yeah.
That you guys together created that conductor that brought these two things together.
Exactly. And we've navigated that, and that's something that I am proud of, because I do feel like there are a lot of fractured families. And when I had Isack, it's the one thing I didn't want. I mean, I don't have a relationship with my family, so I didn't want that to happen.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think you have to be willing to deal with the hard stuff and to talk about the hard stuff. And I think too, like Isack said, we don't give up until it's resolved. Like, there are times where we are trying to hash something out, and we're just not. We're probably saying the same exact thing, but we're not.
We
saying
go round
it
and
the same
round and
language.
round.
Right.
Yeah.
But we'll keep going until we get to a spot where we're like, okay, I get it. And and I think a lot of times when really traumatic things happen, people don't keep going. They just kind of give up on that, and then it creates these big rifts. So I am proud of the fact that we have this kind of relationship that we continue to, like, we want to have this relationship, both of us. It's not just like me trying to have a relationship with Isack, or Isack trying to have a relationship with me. It's something that we both value.
And on that same point, like, when she says we've had times where we've literally gone in circles, sometimes those moments of like hashing those things out, those same arguments will come up for months and months and months until finally we have a breakthrough. Like, I, especially around the time that I moved out, I would say we were at a very, like, living at home in the same household together, and then also having gone through what we did for the 2.5 years before that.
We were both ready for him to move out.
We were, we were at kind of a point in our relationship. Subtly. I wasn't planning on moving out when I did. I wanted to stay home and save some money, but I also knew that if I had stayed home much longer, our relationship would take a hit, a bigger hit, because we were so at odds with each other, just in daily life and like our perceptions of things, and the we would try to hash things out, but it was turning more into arguments than it was hashing things out, I would say. And so I made a decision, kind of things lined up for me, and I made a decision to move out because I was so frustrated, and I didn't want our relationship to take that hit. So I knew that we needed some space from each other.
And I fully supported that and agreed with that perspective. I was like, it's time. Because exactly like Isack said, I think we were at a point where we're going round. And it's because, again, at that point in time, he's 23 now. He was almost 21 when he moved out. Like, we were still earlier in our grief process. So it was a lot tougher, at that particular time. So him moving out and having that distance definitely helped a lot.
But I remember
Go ahead.
I remember a lot of the arguments that, or the problems that we had with each other at that time. Like I remember saying like I just need some time, like to do my own thing. I need time away from you. I need space. And she did not handle that well for a while. Like I was trying to put in this boundary, and she didn't handle that very well for a while. And I remember one day like ignoring her on purpose for the first time, like probably in my entire life. And she got really upset with me about that. And I was like, I told you, I need just a little bit of time to like, I just need some breathing room, and you're not allowing that. And then of course, after I had that time to myself, we eventually came back and like continued that dialogue and hashing those out. And now we're much closer for it. But I think that was the first time that it ever actually had reached that point where like we needed the space.
Yeah.
But I don't think that that's a bad thing either, because
no, not at all. It's sort of like a child that's learning how to ride a bike, and they just took off their training wheels, and the parent doesn't want to let go. Right? They're never going to learn how to ride the two-wheeler if they don't let go, just because you took off the training wheels. So there you are, trying to bring about this concept of autonomy, which all young adults and teenagers are trying to understand as this new concept comes about. But yet, mom, in a loving, caring way, is like, no, where the hell are you going? And it's sort of like, how do we balance with that? And sometimes in order for growth to happen, it needs to be taken away from its true source in order for there to be a identity, which is I think what you guys are talking about.
Well, it's interesting because I think that actually wasn't really the point that we were at when it came to like, it wasn't her needing to let me go to be my own person. It was
I actually had been preparing him his whole his whole teenage
in terms
life,
of like being afraid of letting me go because I wasn't ready to face the world. It wasn't that aspect.
Right.
It was more of I needed time to myself, because between dealing with between having we're both dealing with this issue and the loss, but then I have all this extra responsibility on my plate because I'm trying to help with the household. I'm trying to help with my cousin. I'm trying to, take on all those responsibilities.
Can you talk about that for a second? I want to go back to that, to your niece, and that you've also become a parental figure as well. What was the discussion like, and what were the dynamics like around dealing with the grief, yet also becoming this instant older brother, and the whole dynamics of your life changing? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so almost a year to the dot after my dad died, I think it was literally like that same weekend the following year.
Yeah,
we ended up picking up my cousin from her father's house, and she came to live with us, and it kind of came down to just issues in her household where the few years prior to that, her mom had been in full-blown addiction, and so she was taken out of that house. And then she was living with her dad, and from what I remember, and you can talk about this more, Mom, but my mom had kind of played a role in that whole thing of getting her out of her sister's house. And but she also told my cousin's dad, like, because he had a history of also drug abuse and some other forms of abuse, let's say. And
he was doing good at that moment because my niece was young, so like she was still daddy's little girl, right? So
right. And
but
that helps him, right?
Kind of an agreement of like, you're going to take care of your daughter, but if I'm going to keep a relationship with her, and if I hear anything is wrong at home, I will take her away from you, basically. And things started to get bad at home for her, so my mom kind of had that talk with my cousin and said, like, do you need out of this house? And she said, yes, it's bad. And
which she never had said before. She had always like just totally adored her dad. So for her to get to that point, you knew it was not good.
Something had changed at home.
Yeah. So Isack, what was it like for you, seeing how now the dynamics are going to change again in your household, and only a year later?
I kind of just rolled with it because I knew that's what my cousin needed. But it definitely was a big change because, um, like throughout my childhood, this sort of similar situation had happened twice before where my cousins had come to live with us for, almost a year at a time. Her older brother had actually lived with us when I was 15 for a year. Similar kind of situation. And so like, it wasn't something I was necessarily unfamiliar with because in those other cases, my parents were very good at, you're still our child and you're still our number one priority. So like, even though your cousins are coming to live with us or whatever, like you don't have to take on any responsibility with this. This shouldn't change your life individually. You don't have to like share your space with them if you don't want to. You don't have to, they're not your siblings, so you don't have to treat them as such if you don't feel the need to. And I always kind of did, like, because I always wanted siblings. I think that's one thing about being an only child, is your friends, you tend to mature faster in a lot of ways because the only people you hang out with is adults a lot of the time. Right. You're hanging out with your parents and their friends. You don't have anybody your age to be around. And so that sometimes can be like a lonely feeling. So it was nice having, me and my cousin became friends.
The big thing that you're talking about, yes, there's a nice concept to it, but you said before, mom and dad made it very clear, you're our child, we're taking care of you, don't worry about it, nothing's going to be affected. This is a brand new situation. Yeah. Dad is not in the picture, unfortunately, right now. And it's you and mom. So, and what's that like?
So that was kind of the biggest change is I was an adult, technically, 18, almost 19 when that happened. And, my mom took this on, but I don't think that she didn't have the support that she was used to. And so a lot of times she would turn to me for that support. And that was an interesting thing for me. I was happy to do it for a while because I wanted to help in every way that I could. But I started after, right around the time that I moved out, probably, 6 months, a year before that, I started to kind of realize the toll it was taking on me in terms of like the extra responsibility and like it became kind of, I would say, a little bit of an unhealthy dynamic that we had where even though I was only 3 years older than my cousin, I was taking on a parental role with her in a lot of cases. Or at least I felt that way, in oftentimes when there was a disciplinary thing or like, something that she did that needed consequences, like I was a part of that.
And that's not a role that was meant for you at that time.
Right. And not necessarily coming up with the consequences, but mediating between her and my mother. And like,
So you were playing your dad's role as an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
I think the big challenge too with my niece is that she had been through a lot of trauma and we were both dealing with trauma and she didn't trust adults at all. So although it never was my intention to have Isack sort of play that role, she really loved Isack and she really related to him and she really took his advice to heart. So like I could say something and Isack would say the same exact thing.
Isack said it, that's when it would be less than fair.
Exactly. So unfortunately it developed into this sort of cycle of like, she won't listen to what I'm trying to tell her. And then it just, Isack can get through to her much easier. And unfortunately then.
So why not bring him in the picture more?
It created, and initially he was like really happy to do that. And it was like, they totally were like brother and sister. They goofed around. They had this dynamic. And so like he said, I think initially it wasn't that big of a deal to him. He's happy. But I think the challenge is that it was a continuous thing. Like she had so much trauma and we made lots of progress with her in the 3 years we had her, but there were certain things that just were continued to happen over and over and over again. And then it gets
just based
exhausting.
off of the dynamics. Right. Oh, for sure. For sure.
And so unfortunately go ahead. He felt like he had to be, because he'd already started that process of sort of being the mediator or stepping in and trying to help her see things from a different way, or taking that big brother role, and then dealing with his own grief.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
It got to be a lot. And
yeah, and so for me,
I didn't know how to
kind
change it at that point either.
Yeah, so it came to a kind of a point where I realized, like, this is not my responsibility.
Mm-mm.
And me being a part of it, you know, me being in that role is not doing me any good anymore. It's not, you know, as much as I wanted to help and like make things easier on my mom, and also I did want to help my cousin in many ways, playing that role was not healthy for me anymore. And so I needed to, you know, put in kind of that boundary of like, hey, I can't be this person in this dynamic anymore, because it's impacting me negatively, and I already have all of these other things that I'm trying to get through. And
do it for yourself, because you're also trying to grow up.
Well, exactly. That, you know, that's the other thing, is I'm like, I think I had lost a lot of friends through that period of losing my dad and stuff, because not only was I maybe already a little bit more mature because of being an only child and growing up around adults and like all of that stuff, but
Healthy
then
adults.
But then that happened, and I immediately had all this, you know, very adult responsibility thrust upon me, out of my control. And that was part of the thing when I finally decided to move out when I did, and like needing that break. It wasn't a moment of my mom not wanting to let go because she was afraid I didn't have the tools to face the world, or like that I wasn't ready. It was more of, I was trying to break free because I wanted less responsibility, and I felt like moving out was going to do that for me. Sure. And so, and she was kind of ready, because I had been fighting for that for so long that it was causing that kind of friction in our relationship too. So, living at home, I felt like I had more responsibility than when I moved. I remember moving out and having like this big moment of like, like I had all of this weight lifted off my shoulders, because I suddenly had probably half the responsibility that I felt I did when I was still at home.
Well, and Isack and I have talked about this, and I think what happened and where the sort of misunderstanding, and I think it comes back to why it's so important to communicate. Although when you're dealing with something really traumatic like that, you're both dealing with it, and then the grief is, I've never felt something like that in my entire life. It's super intense, and I'm, you know, Isack either. So you're trying to navigate that, and you don't, there's no roadmap for it. It's not like anything you've experienced before. And I think that, unfortunately, I mean, you know, Isack and I have talked about it a lot around, we both were thrown into a circumstance that was out of our control. So like everything changed for both of us. And, you know, he felt like he had a lot of responsibility. And unfortunately, part of that was a little bit of his dad's fault, in the sense that he sort of did this thing that parents do that I would not recommend parents do, which is, if anything ever happened to me, you're going to take care of your mom, right? You're going to help her out. You're going to, you know, like that whole, like,
you're the man of the house.
The man of the house. You know? And so, unfortunately,
Isack felt responsibility to live up to that.
And I never had that expectation of him, because again, I'm his parent. I might not be dealing with it well, but I'm not expecting him to take it over. He felt like he needed to step up and be helpful in that area. When it became a challenge for us is that there was not a clear transition to when he stopped. So like he worked and did all his own thing, and then he started nursing school, and then he stopped working. So like prior to that, I paid people to do stuff around the house too. So like I didn't necessarily feel like Isack has to do all this stuff around the house, but he also felt this need to try to help and take care of me as well. But then when he was in nursing school, which nursing school is intense. It's literally like the worst thing ever. And so, we both agreed that it was better for him not to have a job at that point, because I went to nursing school and I work part-time, and it's awful. And so at that point, then I was like, okay, you're not working, you're not doing this other thing, you're going to school. So then now it makes sense for you to have some of these responsibilities around the house, right? Like, you live here, you're an adult, like, you're contributing more in, like, we all live in this house versus
so finding that balance of what the responsibility is.
Right. But the problem that happened is that there wasn't a clear transition to that. I felt like I felt like I was not putting that on him. And I don't think I was, but he was taking it on. And then I started putting that expectation on him. And he oftentimes, like, we've hashed it out and we've talked about it, but he felt like that pressure was on him from the very beginning after his dad died. And so there was that muddy water, and then that built up, and there was like a level of resentment. And so, whereas I think in any other situation, if we weren't dealing with this loss, it would have been like a clear transition of dynamic. Right. A clear transition of like, okay, you're an adult, you live at home, and you're not going, you're going to school. So like, you're going to mow the lawn and, do certain things to kind of contribute to the household. And he was already doing all of that stuff. It wasn't my expectation of him, but it did eventually turn into an expectation as part of his contribution to the household. But that wasn't a clear transition. And that is where we had a lot of misunderstanding.
And it sounds like, just hearing you, both of you talk over here, that this is probably something that you guys really go into depth in your podcast. So I'd recommend everyone listening to this, to take a look at it's going and to really get more into the dynamics of responsibilities, communication when it comes to the different dynamics that come about within the home. As we sort of wind down over here, and I have a few questions that I sort of want to get to, but I want to leave one question regarding all this. You look back at your experience that you have, and Suzy, I'm going to start with you. You look back at the experience, and specifically regarding the parenting through these different stages and events and traumatic events that you've been through. What would you say has been something that has been a lesson that you've internalized and you hope that you be able to continue as a parent, continuing on this journey of continuing parenting your adult child right now?
I think, again, I mean, it's been kind of the whole theme of this conversation, but I think because I was such a young parent, I mean, I had Isaac when I was almost 20, and I was still so fresh out of getting out of my own household. And so I very clearly remember all of the dysfunctional communication and the way it felt to like have that dynamic growing up. And so I do think that, I think that a lot of families of, parents and children eventually get there when their kids are adults, where they can sometimes come to an understanding of like being able to communicate with each other. But I didn't want that. I wanted us to be able to communicate regardless from the time he was little all the way to now, and to continue that forward. I didn't want us to have a fractured relationship because we didn't know how to communicate with each other. I didn't want us to have a fractured relationship because he didn't feel like he could communicate with me. And because that's what happened with my mom and I, like, we don't talk, because she's not a safe person to talk to. And so I think the big lesson and the thing, that I've learned over the years is that your kids are never too young to talk about complicated subjects. You have to be conscious of how you lay it out for them, right? So that it's like age appropriate. But if you sort of adopt this mentality of like, if they're asking the question, they deserve an answer, because obviously it's on their mind for some reason. Either they're being exposed to it at school, or they saw something on TV or whatever. And if you
they're just being kids, which is another word for curious.
Right. And if you avoid the topic, you change the subject, or you give them an answer that's not necessarily true, but it just makes you feel more comfortable, you're creating challenges down the road that are going to be harder to deal with when your kids become older, because
so just having that open communication is
the worst.
That's really what it is. Oh, yeah.
And then just remembering that, like, I think the biggest lesson I learned was that they only retain what's relevant to them. So they might ask the question and you give them the answer straight as plain as day. And if it doesn't relate to them in that moment, because that's not something, when he was, what was it, like, I don't know, he's like 3 or 4 years old when he asked about sex. It's like, we told him what it was, but he's just like, has no concept of it. It's not relevant. It doesn't make sense to him. And he's like, oh, okay. And then, he goes on in his life and he didn't remember, because it wasn't something that he had a question. He was curious, but the answer was like, oh, well, okay, I don't need to, like, that doesn't make sense to me, so I don't care. So I think it's just not being afraid to, like, go there with those deep topics or like the uncomfortable topics, because it's about setting a precedent of making it safe for your kids to come talk to you. It's not about the topics itself,
It's about that open door policy, which is, I think, a beautiful, amazing. Yeah. That's really good. I know for me, those the words I always hated hearing is, "You'll understand when you're older." Those those type of lines. Those for sure. Words. Yeah. Go ahead.
Or because I told you so.
Oh my God. Oh.
That was one thing that I would say I always appreciated about my parents, is that almost never did they give me the "oh, because I told you so" line. It was,
I don't think we ever actually did.
Even if they would always give me a reason, even if I didn't agree with it. They would tell me their reasoning behind making a decision.
Right. And it could be a little bit on the authoritarian side, but that's okay, because that's their role. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't something that, like, well, just listen anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I do think, Isack, like, one of the things that Isack can say too is, we gave him freedom and a safe place to disagree with us. So if we did make a decision,
that's really big.
And it was, let's say he wanted to do something and we were like, no, we don't think that's a good idea. The answer is no. We always taught him when he was younger that, like, you always can come back and talk to us and give us supporting reasons as to why you think this would be okay to do, or, whatever you're trying to accomplish. And, there were lots of times that he would be like, Eric and I, his dad, would be like, yeah, he's making some good points, So it wasn't about changing our minds, but it was just acknowledging, okay, I get where you're coming from.
He has a voice.
And he's a person, and, like, these are valid points. And sometimes we still said no, because, again, as a parent, we know the bigger picture that he can't see. And sometimes we would say, okay, valid point. It's still not a complete yes, but, like, it's a yes with some conditions, or, like, and so, like, he never felt like he never felt fearful to come back and be like, well, I don't agree with this decision. I think that so we really gave him a voice as well, which I think he always appreciated it.
And I could always call them out on things that they did,
and we would apologize
either. Yeah, so if they behaved in a way, like, everybody has their off days. Everybody, there were
everybody's
plenty of times,
human,
right? There were plenty of times where I would get yelled at or catch the brunt end of somebody's bad day, and it's like, hey, I was always able to go to them and be like, hey, I didn't appreciate that. I didn't appreciate the way you talked to me or treated me in that way. And there was always that, like, you know what, you're right. I could have handled that better, or that sort of thing. And then that ultimately would bring us closer and make a safer environment for that dialogue,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. That's really, really wonderful here. And I feel there's so many more things that we can talk about, and maybe we'll have a chance to do a follow-up over here. As we sort of close it out over here, I want to put it to each of you, 3 rapid-fire questions. You've ever done this in the dynamic role over here? So we'll sort of see how this goes. I think the first one will be a little bit easy over here. Isack, based on the experiences that you've had and on the story that we've been talking about today, is there a book or a podcast or maybe even a song that you would recommend for people to listen to or watch?
Interesting. Let's see. Personally, outside of anything politics, because I don't really care about that stuff per se, but I think Dr. Jordan Peterson has a lot of really good insight on he's a psychologist and a clinician, and he has a lot of very good insight about just growing up and discovering yourself and learning how to interact with the world as well as communicate with others and do those sorts of things in a healthy way. So I always like listening to some of his lectures and podcasts and stuff, because there's always something interesting on that front.
Beautiful. Suzy, coming from you, is there anything to listen to or something that you've read that's really helped you over this amazing journey that you've been on?
Yeah, there's there is this amazing person on TikTok, especially because it's very in line with this, with your podcast and what you're doing. She is called, her handle is at Crooked Counselor Cooper, I think. But she's a trauma therapist, who has gone through a lot of her own trauma. And I believe that she didn't even become a therapist until quite a bit later in her life. But she has younger kids. And so she really creates a lot of content that normalizes parenting when you've experienced a lot of trauma, in terms of how kids can trigger your trauma, right? Like, you start to recognize.
For sure. Oh, we could talk about that forever. What is her handle again, so I can try to put it in the show notes?
At Crooked Counselor Cooper, I think is what it is.
Okay.
And
we will look it up. We will try to post that.
She's amazing, and she's funny. So like, she's got like a snarky sense of humor.
She brings humor.
She likes hip hop, but she really validates people, and just normalizes a lot of the emotions that as parents we all feel when we're raising kids, especially when we've dealt with stuff. Yeah.
Suzy, is there a story or a situation that you can share as a parent that you find now could be really hysterical or funny to share?
That's an interesting question.
I feel like Isack already has one in the back of his head right now, but
I feel like he should probably go first. Yeah, because my brain, since all this has happened, like, my memory is so horrible.
I don't know if I mean, it's not too bad.
I have one now.
Do you remember when I was probably 14? We had just moved into our house, and oftentimes before, like, we would all go to bed, I would go up, or like, my room was next to theirs for a while, so I would go and stand in their doorway and kind of talk to them while they're like laying in bed or getting ready or
He's
whatever.
He's gonna embarrass me now.
No, I don't think this is where you thought it was going.
Oh, I hope not.
We had a cat at the time, and the cat had jumped into like their dirty clothes hamper and was like digging around in there. And we were just having normal conversation, and my mom blurts out, like, Fiona, which was our cat's name, stop like smelling my underwear. And without missing a beat, and this was like, I didn't really have this level of humor with my parents. This was something I would have said to my high school friends. But without missing a beat, and before I could even think about what I was saying, I said, well, it probably smells like fish. And then immediately everyone was like, what? What did you just say? And I realized, and I was like, all right, good night. And I turned around and went to bed. And for like a half hour, I could hear them like both laughing all night.
Oh my God, we were dying. Because
I was very embarrassed, like, because
my husband and I looked at each other like, did he just say that out loud?
I was like, well, it was one of those moments where, like, I said it before I thought about who I was saying it to, and I was like, okay, yeah. I'm just gonna excuse myself from this situation now.
Oh, that's amazing. That is a great story. Suzy, how about you?
So when Isack was probably about, I think he probably would have been 6 or 7, maybe between 6 and 8. We he slammed his finger inside like the car door, no, he didn't slam his finger. He burnt it on something. I don't know if he was like trying to cook something or whatever. So he had like a blister on the end of his finger. And he just was telling about, we were on our way to our good friends who only lived a couple miles away. And he was, we were in the truck and he's in the middle between the two of us. And he's showing us this blister on his finger. And it's like, oh my goodness, like, why didn't you say anything? You know, because like, obviously that had to have hurt, like, you know, because he didn't come and tell us that like he had hurt himself. And he's like, and he goes, yeah, whatever. I took it like a man. So like, he just used to say the funniest things like that when he was little. Like
That's
he just
amazing.
he definitely has inherited his dad's sense of humor.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Suzy, so my last question for you, if you could think of a everyday mundane superpower that you would like to have as a parent that would assist in your parenting, what would that be?
A mundane superpower. Honestly, like I would love to just have things magically clean themselves. Like,
I'm hearing that so often from parents on this podcast, but you know what? I agree. It's like having one of Harry Potter's little spells to just clean everything up really fast.
I did that on a social media post once. I was like, what is the one thing that you would totally do if you could afford, but people would judge you for it? And I was like, I would have a live-in like housekeeper / person who makes food for me.
Isack, so seeing your story, your wonderful story, and you know, hopefully one day you'll get to be a parent. What would be one superpower that you would want to have as a parent?
Yeah, I would like honestly probably the same thing, because generally, you know, that was always I would say, especially after my dad died, that was always a friction point between me and my mom. Is I am not a messy person. I don't like having, you know, junk all over, and or like, you know, just I don't like things being messy, and not that they have to be spotless either, but you know, a good middle ground.
Right.
And I think my mom doesn't care quite as much about that stuff as I do.
I do care. It's just that you only can handle so much at a certain point. And so like some things just have to give. Yeah. Which is why I would just have somebody.
Yeah, I would honestly probably agree with that, because it would free up a lot of my time.
Yeah, wouldn't we all? Guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. I hope everyone goes to check out your podcast. Again, it's going. And
it's going. If
go
you
ahead.
Look up,
please share more stuff.
Yeah, I mean, essentially all our social media handles are pretty much at It's Going Podcast. I think Instagram has like an It's Going _podcast, but the on the regular podcast platforms, we do have video on Spotify and we do video on YouTube. But it's just it's going. It's a blue tile with a chat bubble. It says It's Going, and then underneath it says with Suzy and Isack. So yeah. So
awesome.
You definitely get to see more of the dynamic that we have.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I hope we get a chance to meet up more.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it. I think this is amazing.
Hey again. I hope you were able to learn as much as I did today. Thank you so much for staying to the end and listening to the entire interview. Please feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. All comments will be read weekly, and we appreciate all feedback and ideas. If you have an idea for a guest or a specific topic, please feel free to share. Additionally, you can contact us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining today, and remember, parenting is a journey. Don't forget to enjoy it. The goal is to be a little better today than yesterday, and hopefully better tomorrow than we were today.